The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a polished, frozen lake, reflecting the sharp, sterile glare of the fluorescent lights. The air in the room was heavy, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and cheap corporate panic. They thought they were holding all the cards, waiting for her to break. They had no idea the trap was already sprung. The silence in room 4. 04 wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, expensive, and laced with the distinct scent of a high-stakes ambush. The glass walls looked out over a sprawling maze of open-plan cubicles where hundreds of employees tapped away at keyboards, blissfully unaware of the execution happening behind closed doors. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a mid-quarter alignment meeting. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the cool edge of the mahogany table. Across from her sat Victoria, the Vice President of Human Resources, flanked by 2 stone-faced representatives from the legal team. Victoria's posture was immaculate, her tailored blazer practically radiating institutional authority. She exhaled a slow, patronizing sigh that was meant to disarm, but only managed to betray her impatience. "Elena, let's be realistic here," Victoria began, her voice dripping with calculated sympathy as she leaned forward. "You just don't understand how the corporate world works. There are systems in place. There are hierarchies. Trying to push this narrative isn't just career suicide. It's entirely unsubstantiated." One of the legal reps subtly shifted his weight, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad, like a vulture waiting for a sign of weakness. They expected tears, or perhaps a defensive outburst. They expected her to beg for a severance package. Instead, Elena smiled. It was a faint, almost imperceptible twitch of her lips, but it made the legal rep lower his pen. "Unsubstantiated," Elena repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air like a plume of smoke. "That's an interesting choice of words, Victoria, especially since you're relying entirely on the assumption that what happens in the dark stays there." The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone, suddenly sounding deafeningly loud. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, a hairline fracture appearing in her flawless corporate facade. She adjusted her designer glasses, attempting to regain the high ground. "We operate on facts, Elena, not grievances." Without a word, Elena reached into her leather briefcase. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. She pulled out a sleek, matte black laptop, flipped it open, and turned the screen directly toward the trio. The display didn't show a messy desktop or a standard corporate presentation. It showed a single, open directory window. The path at the top read, secure_backup/archive, and inside, highlighted in a stark, neon blue selection box, was a single folder. It was called recorded_calls. Victoria's gaze locked onto the screen. For a fraction of a second, her professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated panic before she forced her features back into a rigid, icy stare. The legal team looked at the folder, then at Victoria, then back at the folder. The atmosphere in the room plummeted by 10 degrees. "We are an at-will employment state, Elena," the senior legal rep intervened, his voice cutting through the tension with practiced neutrality. "And furthermore, recording company communications without explicit dual-party consent is a direct violation of your onboarding agreement. You're playing a very dangerous game." Elena didn't blink. She reached for the trackpad, her fingers moving with the calm deliberation of a grandmaster, making a final, decisive move on a chessboard. "I'm well aware of the state laws, compliance protocols, and the employee handbook," Elena said, her tone conversational, almost light. "Which is exactly why these aren't standard phone logs. Every single file in this directory was routed through the secure, client-facing compliance server, the one the board authorized for quality and training purposes 3 quarters ago. You see, when you routed your private internal discussions through the external bridge to bypass audit logging, you inadvertently archived everything on the immutable cloud ledger. She tapped the trackpad twice. The folder expanded, revealing a meticulously organized timeline of audio files, complete with timestamps, metadata, and automated speaker tags. The first file at the top of the list was dated 3 weeks prior. The speaker tags read Victoria_HR_VP and external_vendor_04. Victoria's hand went instinctively to her pearl necklace. The legal reps leaned in, their professional detachment evaporating in real time as they realized the sheer scale of the digital landmine they were sitting on. They weren't just looking at a disgruntled employee's personal stash, they were looking at a master key to the company's deepest secrets. Every conversation was recorded, Elena whispered into the sudden, suffocating silence. She hovered the cursor over the play button of the most recent file. The timestamp read, yesterday, 4:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before the internal audit trail had mysteriously gone cold. If they let her press play, the carefully constructed walls of the executive suite would crumble before the market opened tomorrow. But what they didn't know was that this folder was only the tip of an iceberg that had already started tearing through the ship's hull. The silence stretched so thin it felt as though the glass walls of room 404 might shatter from the pressure. Victoria's hand remained frozen at her collarbone, her knuckles turning a sharp, porcelain white against her skin. The legal team had completely abandoned their posture of detached authority. They were staring at the glowing monitor like mechanics looking at a ticking engine. Elena let the cursor hover over the play button for 3 agonizing seconds before lifting her fingers from the trackpad. She didn't need to press play. The metadata displayed on the screen, the file sizes, the continuous timestamps, the encrypted hash keys, spoke a language that the legal team understood all too well. It was the language of an ironclad, unalterable discovery process. "This is highly irregular," the senior legal rep managed to say, though his voice lacked its previous venom. He looked at his colleague, silently signaling for a lifeline that wasn't coming. "Elena, you must realize that sharing proprietary data outside the organization—" "I haven't shared it outside," Elena interrupted smoothly, her voice dropping into a comforting, almost maternal cadence that made the room feel even smaller. "Not yet, because as a loyal employee, I felt it was my duty to ensure the internal mechanisms worked first. I've simply forwarded a mirrored copy of the ledger to the one person who actually has a fiduciary duty to care." Victoria finally found her voice, though it sounded reedy, stripped of its executive veneer. "Who?" Elena closed the laptop with a soft, definitive thud. "The Chief Operating Officer. He likes to start his day early, doesn't he?" Miles away, in the quiet penthouse office on the top floor of the corporate headquarters, the morning sun was just beginning to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, amber shadows across a desk made of dark slate. It was exactly 7 a.m. Arthur Vance, the COO, sat alone in the quiet building, the city below him still waking up under a blanket of dawn mist. He was a man who lived by metrics, precision, and an absolute intolerance for variables. On his desk sat a single steaming cup of black coffee and a secure company-issued tablet. At 7:01 a.m., a notification flashed across the screen. The sender wasn't an internal address. It was an automated alert, triggered from the secure cloud ledger, bypass routed around the standard IT gatekeepers. Arthur reached out, his thumb tapping the screen. The document opened with a stark, red header that shattered the morning tranquility of his office. Report Section 8 Internal Fraud Review. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his face hardened into stone. The report didn't contain vague allegations or interpersonal complaints. It was a forensic autopsy of a systematic kickback scheme, complete with exact dollar amounts, shell company routing numbers, and direct references to the audio files currently sitting on Elena's laptop in room 404. By exactly 7:02 a.m., the COO reviewed Report Section 8. He didn't call HR. He didn't call the legal team. He picked up his secure line and dialed the external federal compliance hotline. Back in the conference room, the clock on the wall ticked to 7:03 a.m. Elena watched the color drain completely from Victoria's face as a synchronized chime echoed from both legal representatives' pockets. Their corporate smartphones were vibrating in unison, flashing an urgent, system-wide lockdown alert originating directly from the executive suite. The game was over, and the realization was washing over them like ice water. But as Victoria stared at Elena with a mixture of dread and defeat, she still didn't realize the deepest layer of the trap that had just snapped shut around them all. If you are enjoying this corporate thriller and want to find out how deep the rabbit hole goes, make sure to save this story and hit the follow button so you don't miss the next dramatic breakdown in the boardroom. What do you think Arthur Vance will do next? Let me know your theories in the comments. The synchronized vibration of the smartphones on the mahogany table sounded like a swarm of hornets. The senior legal rep picked up his device with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the flashing text. Elena didn't need to read the screen to know what it said. The system-wide administrative lockdown was a standard protocol, but when initiated directly by the COO's office, it was the digital equivalent of a hard ceiling dropping onto a room. "Our access keys," the younger lawyer whispered, his face turning an ashen gray as he stared at his screen. "They've been revoked. All of them. Internal communications, the legal database, the Active Directory. We're locked out." Victoria's gaze remained fixed on Elena's closed laptop. The realization of what had just happened was sinking in, transforming her corporate arrogance into a heavy, suffocating despair. She looked like a gambler who had just realized she was playing against the house with loaded dice. "You planned this," Victoria said, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the air conditioning. "You didn't just find the files, you timed the upload. You waited for the exact moment the automated audit scripts would cycle." "I didn't plan your choices, Victoria," Elena replied, her tone perfectly even, devoid of malice or triumph. "I just took notes. When you spent the last 6 months routing vendor contracts through your brother-in-law's logistics firm, you left footprints. When you used the compliance server to discuss the layout of those offshore accounts because you thought the encryption was unbreakable, you gave me the map." She stood up, smoothing the front of her skirt. The movement was calm, deliberate, and entirely free of the frantic energy that was currently vibrating through the other 3 people in the room. The senior legal rep looked up, his professional bravado entirely gone. "Elena, wait. There are protocols for internal reporting. We can restructure this. We can present this to the board as a self-contained anomaly. If this goes public, the stock price, the entire compliance division." "The compliance division is currently being audited by an external third party," Elena interrupted, slinging her briefcase over her shoulder. "Arthur Vance didn't just open Report Section 8, he authenticated the cryptographic ledger. By now, the digital forensics team he retained last month is already downloading the raw data packets from the secure cloud bridge." Victoria's head snapped up. "Last month? Arthur knew?" Elena paused at the door, her hand resting on the brushed steel handle. She looked back at the 3 of them, sitting under the harsh fluorescent glare, surrounded by the useless remnants of their corporate authority. "Arthur knew there was a leak," Elena said softly. "He just didn't know who was pulling the strings." "You thought you were setting an ambush for a whistleblower this morning, Victoria, but you were actually just walking into a deposition." As she pushed the glass door open, the muted roar of the open plan office flooded into the room. But behind her, inside room 404, the silence returned, thicker, colder, and absolute. The glass door clicked shut behind Elena, cutting off the suffocating silence of room 404. Stepping out into the sprawling, multi-tiered atrium of the corporate headquarters felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Around her, the morning routine was in full swing. Elevators chimed, the aroma of freshly roasted coffee drifted from the lobby kiosk, and hundreds of analysts moved briskly between glass cubicles, completely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred on the executive floor. Elena walked with a calm, unhurried pace toward the elevators, her heels clicking softly against the polished terrazzo floor. The sound was rhythmic, almost therapeutic. With every step, she could feel the immense weight of the last 6 months lifting from her shoulders. She had lived in the shadows of their spreadsheets and deleted emails for what felt like an eternity, but the light of day had finally caught up to them. Suddenly, the sleek chrome doors of the executive elevator slid open. Stepping out into the atrium was a small, fast-moving phalanx of men and women in dark, tailored suits. They didn't wear company badges. Instead, silver lapel pins caught the sharp morning light. Leading the group was a woman with sharp features and a leather portfolio gripped tightly under her arm, the lead investigator from the External Regulatory Authority. Behind them, 2 of the company's internal security guards followed, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. They weren't heading for the standard offices. They were marching directly toward the HR suite and the legal department. Elena caught the eye of the lead investigator as they crossed paths in the wide corridor. A brief, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that the package had been delivered, verified, and opened. Turning back toward the glass facade of the building, Elena looked up at the top floor where the COO's office sat. The blinds were drawn tight against the rising sun. Arthur Vance was a man of his word. Once the numbers proved a systemic failure, he didn't hesitate to cut out the rot. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a single, encrypted text message from an unknown number. Secured. Stand down. Your presence is no longer required on site. Elena looked down at the screen, a faint smile touching her lips. But as she reached the exit turns, she noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. The digital directory board in the main lobby, which listed all active executive extensions and office assignments, suddenly flickered. Right before her eyes, Victoria's name, along with both legal representatives' profiles, vanished from the screen, replaced by a cold, system-generated string of text. Account suspended. The corporate machine was erasing them in real time. Yet, as Elena pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the crisp, bright morning air, she realized that the directory hadn't just removed Victoria's team. There was a second anomaly on the flashing screen, a detail she hadn't expected, and one that suggested Report Section 8 had triggered a sequence of events no one, not even Arthur Vance, could fully control. The cool morning breeze hit Elena's face, carrying the sharp scent of damp asphalt and distant city traffic. She stood on the wide, granite steps of the plaza, her phone still tightly gripped in her hand. Behind her, the massive glass tower reflected the pale blue sky like a giant vertical mirror, beautiful, imposing, and entirely hollow. Slowly, she looked back through the rotating glass doors, her eyes locking onto the flashing digital directory board one last time before the glare of the sun cut off her view. The screen hadn't just wiped out the HR and legal teams. Right beneath the empty slots where Victoria's department used to be, a secondary command script was overriding the main display. The name, Arthur Vance, was gone. In its place, the system was cycling a blanket administrative notice. Executive Office Level 40, restricted access by order of global compliance. Arthur hadn't just cut out the rot. The rot had already climbed higher than he realized, and by initiating the immutable ledger protocol, he had accidentally triggered an automated trapdoor beneath his own feet. The system didn't care about corporate titles or fiduciary duties. It only cared about the mathematical certainty of the breach. Elena let out a slow, deliberate breath, the vapor vanishing into the crisp air. For months, she had thought she was playing a highly dangerous game of corporate chess against Victoria. Now, watching the digital dominoes fall with terrifying, algorithmic speed, she realized she had merely been the one to tip the very first piece. The real players hadn't even shown their faces yet. She slipped her phone into her pocket, turned her back on the glass tower, and walked down the steps into the shifting crowd of the morning commute, blending seamlessly into the sea of ordinary people. She had done her job. She had delivered the records. Now, it was time to watch the empire burn from a safe distance.